Hello, I'm Paul Miles with the International Society for Biblical Hermeneutics, and today we are here with Dr. Eduardo Perez, who will be presenting on Messiah in the Psalter. Dr. Perez, thank you so much for joining us. Take it away.
I appreciate it. Good morning. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to Dr. Miles. Thank you for giving me the opportunity and inviting me to speak here. For all of the participants that are here and eager to listen to what I might have to say, let me apologize up front. Um, you might be so ensconced in a particular view of the Psalms that might not be your cup of tea. I'm just kidding. Of course, I'm your cup of tea. It's the Bible, and I'm gonna fix it for us. Just kidding. Just kidding. But no, I'm really, really grateful for being here. It's been a long journey to get to this point, so I'm grateful to share the research that I've done, and hopefully it would enhance how we think about the Psalms in some way, and it would glorify Christ, magnify His name. So that's what I want to do, and that's why I wanted to study at a institution that let us study the Bible for the Bible's sake and its sophistication, rather than just being ensconced in what a lot of other people say about the Bible. I was grateful to be able to actually study the Bible. So happy to do that. So the title of my dissertation was A Prophetic and Messianic Literary Approach to Reading the Psalter, arising from the elements of storyline and the principle of juxtaposition found in the Psalter's introduction. You can tell from that title, it is long, but it's not just long. It gives you the two main ideas of what I was trying to drive at in this study. It's the principle of juxtaposition that isn't new. A lot of people know it, but the elements of storyline are what I think I was actually contributing, and I think it does enhance how we understand the Psalms. So I have an outline for us. If I can, here we go. So I'm going to make some preliminary remarks. I'm going to describe how I came to the present study, sort of the background things that influenced me to get to this point. I'm going to introduce the study, and then I'm going to talk about just briefly where this dissertation enters the scholarly conversation. And then I'm going to give you my thesis and the steps of analysis. And then I'm going to give some examples of what I found and the overall tracing of what I call the literary story. And then also for these up and comers behind us or people who are just interested, new vistas for further study. And then I'll just conclude with just a remark or two. So for my preliminary remarks, the first thing I want to say is I'm really, this is a big ask. And the reason it's a big ask is because I'm asking us to remove some preconceived notions. I don't know what your experience with the Psalms has been. I can tell you what mine has been. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we do come to the text with presuppositions, and one of the biggest presuppositions we come to the text with are that the Psalms are about David's life, and I would never deny Davidic involvement and composition of many of the Psalms. But because what that has done is our preconceived notion of looking at David's life is we look backwards for what the Psalms might be saying when they might actually be inviting us to look forward. So I want us to just think about that. The other thing I want to think about is, for example, if you pull up any commentary off your bookshelf and you go to Psalm 1, overwhelmingly, you're going to learn or read from these commentators and others that Psalm 1 is a wisdom psalm. And it's a proverbial psalm about this blessed man who is this godly man. And I'm thinking that it's more than that. So I'll explain what I mean here in a minute. But just want us to just remove some preconceived notions and let's just let the text say what it says, without bringing in a lot of the influences that I think have created some lenses by which we see the Psalter. The second thing I want to say as a reminder is that something is gained, not lost, when we arrive at the author's intended meaning or reading strategy. I think that something is gained. I'll give you an example. The way that I read Psalm 1 is not the way that many commentators want us to read it. When I read Psalm 2, there's a statement in Psalm 2 that is pointing forward, but because of our preconceived notions, one of the verbs there is translated as a past tense when it might be a prophetic future. And then when I read Psalm 3, there's a lexical link to that verb that shows that it is actually should be interpreted as a future kind of idea. So when we read the Psalms holistically, canonically, uh, with the principle of juxtaposition in mind, meaning they were arranged on purpose and they're providing a meaning, it's going to force us to really maybe change the way we think about some Psalms. One of the big ones is Psalm 51. Of course, Psalm 51, that's David repenting. But one of the problems that, even though a lot of commentators have tried to get around, is they say, well, in Psalm 51, he says, only against you, Yahweh, have I sinned. But we know in Psalm 51, um, uh, if that's the way, if it's about David repenting for his sin with Bathsheba, he sinned against others, not just Yahweh. So we have a pressure release valve in how we interpret that by saying, well, he felt so contrite that he was only talking to Yahweh. But if we read Psalm 51 in light of Psalm 50, then what I think we see is that we see the voice of the divine hero, the Messiah, demanding repentance, and then in Psalm 51 you see a person repenting. That changes how we view that. That changes how we color these things. So um, uh, that doesn't take anything away. I think something is gained if we read it according to the intended reading strategy rather than maybe maintaining preconceived notions. So that's just a reminder. The other thing I want to say is that I wasn't I'm not inventing something new, but rather I'm possibly recapturing how the ancients understood the Psalter. I made this statement earlier, but in the New Testament authors, I never see them quoting a psalm and identifying its form, a la Hermann Gunkel or something like that. Many times they're applying it to Christ, and they have a paradigm of how they're reading it that helps them to do that. And I think that that's something that I am touching on in this study. I think that's actually where what's happening is that they have a reading strategy, why they can apply some passages to Christ, and they just assume that it's about him. And then lastly is that this study does not have it all figured out, but gives a great starting point for others to build on. So these are just some quick preliminary remarks. The genesis of the present study is years ago in 2016. I had just graduated from undergrad in 2013. I was 3 years into my THM program at Data Seminary, and Dr. Joe Parle, who ended up being the outside reader for this study, invited me to Dr. Bruce Walke's Psalm lectures. He was giving some lectures in Houston, and they were being recorded by Bill Mounts, and so it was for the Biblical Training Center that Bill Mounts runs. And it was really intimate. It was about maybe 10 or 15 people in this house in Houston. At the time I was born and raised in Houston, so I was still living in Houston. And I was invited to go and see Dr. Bruce Walke give these lectures on these Psalms. And they really just encouraged me to dig deeper into the Psalms. There I am with Bruce Walke, and he's laughing because I told him to suck his stomach in so that we can look thinner in the picture. And there's me and Bill Mounts, who was recording everything. So if you watch those lectures, you'll hear Dr. Walke ask me personally some questions. So I am enshrined in those videos when Bruce Walke says, "What do you think about this, Eduardo?" And then you can hear a voice, and that's me. I was there. So that really started my pursuit of the Psalms, or studying them deeper, was Bruce Walke's lectures. The other thing was the general tenor of my previous training at the College of Biblical Studies and at Dallas Theological Seminary, when it came to the Psalms, overwhelmingly was part of a larger body of study on biblical Hebrew poetry and the parallelisms, synonymous Hebrew parallelism, antithetical parallelism. We kind of did that. I read some work from Alan Cooper in the PhD program at Calvary, and saw that the parallelisms were actually deeper, that you could go phonologically, you could go syntactically, you can morphologically, lexically. So there was a lot of ways that the parallelisms worked. But when I did my undergrad program and some work at DTS, it's not their fault. It's my own deficiency. I probably didn't read enough, but it just felt like the overwhelming idea was the quest was for the form, according to Hermann Gunkel's forms, or dealing with some of Mo Winkle's quote criticism, and what kind of parallelisms are you dealing with? And that was the extent of it. Again, not an indictment on these institutions. They're great, and I appreciated my training there. I think it's only my own deficiency. I didn't read enough. And that's just kind of what I left away with. When I would read a psalm or teach a psalm, I would start off with, if there was a superscription and it was about David, then I would take that route. I would try to identify the Sitz im Leben, the life situation in the Old Testament that might apply to that psalm, and that's how I would do it. And that's what happened until I took Dr. Lyons' class at the PhD program in at Calvary University when we went over the biblical poetry module, and he had me read Dr. Cole's Gateway to the Psalter, and this book really just was very influential for me. It was published by Sheffield, so it was really expensive for what you get. It was a great, powerful book, but it was small, and what Cole was arguing for is he I think quite compellingly argued that Psalms 1 and 2 are the introduction to the Psalter. And I was convinced by that idea. So that I said, if Psalms 1 and 2 are the gateway to the Psalter, then how if it's the introduction, then how does it function as the introduction, and what does that mean for the Psalms that come behind it? So based on that, I developed a preliminary formulation, and I called it the Messianic psyche in the Psalter. And I wrote a paper that suggested that wherever the Psalms, I argued that the Psalms are prophetically messianic rather than reflecting the milieu during the Davidic dynasty, and that the word psyche means that where the psalmist is speaking or doing, it should be understood that it is the pre-incarnate Messiah who is speaking or doing, unless something in the context clearly prevents it from being so. And this preliminary formulation was far too ambitious and overstated. I was really dinged on it, but it did give me a framework to start thinking differently about the Psalms. So even though I overstated it and I had to rework it, I did see that there was something more going on. And that led me to something that I remembered when I was at Dallas Seminary, and that was Dr. Charles Bayless and the Biblical Story series that he did. And he talked about how the Bible itself in the beginning has a happy beginning, and then it has a problem initiated, what we call the inciting moment, and then there's a conflict established and the plan that rises up to resolve the conflict to a resolution, and then it results in a happy ending. And he said that this is the normal way that stories are told in narrative prose, that these are the elements that you would normally find. And I remember that. And he said the basic plot of the Bible looks like this. You have man who's set to rule. Then you have the inciting moment with the serpent, the antagonist. Then there's a tension. God's rule through man is reversed based on the rebellion that the serpent helped initiate in Genesis 3. And then you have the rising action up to the cross where the protagonist brings forth the new Adam, and then the new rule of the new Adam, and then a happy ending, as you would, at the end of it. And one thing we can say about the entire biblical story, that in Genesis, in the beginning, you have the setting, the creation, you have the philosophy of the protagonist, Yahweh wanting to have human intermediaries rule the creation on his behalf, Genesis 1:26-28. And then you have the inciting moment in Genesis 3 with the serpent and the rebellion. And then at the end of the book of the Bible, at the end of Revelation, you have the serpent reappearing in Genesis, I think it's 12:9 and 20 verse 2 with the serpent of old. I'm sorry, Revelation. The serpent's mentioned, and at the end of it, you have the tree of life again. Instead of a garden, you have a holy city. You have God there with his people, and you see a clear resolution and happy ending to the story. And all of these elements dovetailed in when I started looking at the Psalms. If Psalms 1 and 2 are the introduction, then and if Psalms 1 and 2 are juxtaposed on purpose as the introduction, then uh, are there storyline elements in the introduction as we would find like in Genesis 1 through 3 or something like that? And if I can identify those, do those in conjunction with the principle of juxtaposition, where they're arranged on purpose, will that give us the prism for the reading strategy? So that was kind of what dovetailed into the present study. So the need of the study was that we needed a fresh take at literary approaches that take the elements in the Psalter's introduction, Psalms 1 and 2, as a guiding principle for understanding the whole. The importance of the study is that the reality is that we have lenses, and they influence me just as much. I'm sure they influenced a lot of people. When you open any commentary on the Psalms, the main or at least one of the main approaches is going to be form criticism. Form criticism has cast a long shadow over Psalm studies, so much so that even modern publications on the Psalms still adhere to Gunkel's form criticism, or at least his methods. So I felt like maybe that's blinding us. And now my study wasn't a polemic against form criticism. I was just saying, let's just set that aside for now and see if we can make sense of the Psalms on their own merit without seeking or being on a quest to find what kind of psalm, what form of the Psalms it is, and what is it a lament psalm or is it a royal psalm? Is it a wisdom psalm? Instead, let's just read it on its own merits and see if they're juxtaposed on purpose and if the cast of characters or the storyline elements can be identified. So that brought me to the purpose of the study, and it's to show that by analyzing each psalm through the prism of the first two, that is the Psalter's introduction and so on, a usable story would emerge. That story will be seen to be prophetically messianic, demonstrating the unity of the Psalter with a messianic intention. And my method was this. So I identified the storyline elements in Psalms 1 and 2. And in order to have storyline elements, you need to have a cast of characters. And we have dual protagonists, Yahweh and the divine hero. Now, whatever Yahweh has said, his actions, intentions, thoughts, and those sorts of ideas, internal disposition, the divine hero would be seen to have the same thing. And in the Psalms that I covered, that's exactly what I found. Then you can have an antagonist or antagonists. And I call them the wicked collectively in uppercase, just not because they have divinity, but because they're a unique literary group that can be found in both Psalm 1 and 2. And within the wicked, later on, as downstream from the first introduction of the Psalms, a singular enemy begins to emerge. And we see that in Psalm 5 and in Psalm 7. You have foils, and one of the foils is a collective group called the righteous who switch sides and experience blessing. Um, uh, in Psalm 2, the messianic personage asks the nations to reconsider their position. And he says, blessed are all those who take refuge in him. And there's an inclusio there with the first word of Psalm 1 and the last phrase in Psalm 2:12 that encapsulates it with the word ashrei, the word blessing. So there's foils there. The wicked are in the antagonist, and the foils are the righteous who switch sides and experience blessing. And we should be able to see something like that if that is the case. So that's the cast of characters. And I think those are identifiable in Psalms 1 and 2. And then there's an inciting moment. This is the moment where the problem occurs, and the inciting moment is the wicked's hostility towards Yahweh and the divine hero. And we see that in Psalm 2, the wicked's rage. They are hostile towards Yahweh and his Messiah. I'll show you that a little bit later. And then the philosophy of the dual protagonist is to establish the divine hero on Mount Zion in a worldwide Malkut or kingdom rule. And then you'll see an enduring conflict, death for the wicked and blessing for the righteous who pledge fealty to Yahweh. So these are the storyline elements that I think can be clearly identified in Psalms 1 and 2. If that's the case, then the steps of analysis would be for each psalm to determine the cast of characters. Is there a narrator? In Psalms 1 and 2, a narrator sets everything up. And then can we identify Yahweh and the divine hero from psalm to psalm? Can we identify a people group or a character group, a literary character group called the wicked from psalm to psalm? Can we identify the righteous as foils or a character group from psalm to psalm? And if so, can we trace any plot movement? And then, so I did that for each psalm that I was able to cover. And then I summarized each one after I did those steps of analysis. And for my study, because of space, I could only analyze Psalms 1 and 2 to show the storyline elements, and then the juxtaposition of Psalms 3 through 7 to show that the method worked. And then I give an overview of Psalm 8 in connection to Psalm 7, just to give the sense that, look, if it worked here, then we should be confident that it might work moving forward. And as I did that, a discernible prophetically messianic story began to be discerned. This is the essence of the method. Identify the storyline elements. This is the part that, to my knowledge, no one has ever done. Identify storyline elements in the Psalter's introduction. What has been done and what is well known is the principle of juxtaposition, where a lot of people have already identified over the last 40 years that several Psalms are juxtaposed or intentionally arranged, and themes and word key phrases and words are said in one and picked up in other psalms downstream from there. But what I'm adding is this part here, the storyline elements, and in conjunction with the principle of juxtaposition, I think that's where we get the reading strategy for the entire Psalter. So that's the method. What are some of the assumptions that the study had? I had to have some assumptions, and so the first one is I'm assuming the canonicity of the Book of Psalms. I'm assuming that Psalms 1 and 2 work together to form the introduction of the Psalter. I'm assuming Davidic involvement in authorship and some of the editorial process. I'm Now, for the sake of this study, the superscriptions are assumed to be later editorial additions, and should not interfere with the literary approach, even though they do enhance it. For example, where the Septuagint would on there's a Hebrew phrase that's usually translated for the choir director. I'm probably going to mangle the pronunciation because I don't have it in front of me, but it's manaksa. And then the Septuagint would translate that as eis ta telos, towards the end, or something like that, or moving forward, or look forward, something that has to do with moving forward or towards something else, rather than the choir director. So uh, for the sake of the study, I didn't want to get bogged down on trying to argue whether they were spurious or whether they were part of the original Psalter. All I said was that if there's a usable story based on the principle of juxtaposition and the storyline elements, then the superscriptions shouldn't interfere, but they might enhance, and I think they did. And number five, the Masoretic text is the best representation of the Book of Psalms available and will be the body of literature to work from. The Dead Sea Scrolls have a lot of material, but their arrangement it's a little different, especially PSLQ or LQPSA. Had about 43 psalms with some non-canonical works inserted in there, so couldn't really use it, but I did address it in the dissertation. And then finally, the unity of the book, again, the canonicity, but also the unity. It was arranged on purpose, intentionally, and handed down the way it was intended to be handed down. Those are the assumptions. And the boundaries of the study, and this is the biggest area of where I think criticism can come from, is I can only cover Psalms 1 through 7 with an overview of Psalm 7's connection to Psalm 8. I was really ambitious and thought that I could cover the book one of Psalms to show that it worked in book one, but the criticism would be the same. If this method worked in book one, how would I be certain that it would work in the other four books of the Psalms in their division? I couldn't. Also, um, the more that I saw the lexical, thematic, syntactical links between Psalms, the bigger the information got. And by the time I got to Psalm 7, the sections in my dissertation were longer. And it was almost like a snowball. The more information, the bigger it got. So I just couldn't cover more than what I could cover. Now, just to be fair, there are dissertations that cover one psalm or a few verses, or so I tried to do more than that, but I just couldn't do more than this. My limits were it had to be broad enough to encompass the requirements for Calvary University's program, and it had to be small enough that I could fit within the page range that they gave me to work with. So I could only do Psalms 1 through 7 with a small section closing on Psalm 8's connection to Psalm 7. So that's the boundaries of the study. Now, with that, it brings me to my next point. I see I'm running out of time. Really quick, just the history of interpretation, where I'm entering the conversation. I cover the first wave of Psalter studies with the earliest data sets, and that's the superscriptions, the Qumran material, and the New Testament. And I'll move on from that to the second wave, how Herman Gunkel changed the landscape of Psalm studies. And then he strove to define all Psalms in the Psalter according to their Gattingen or genre and to discover each type sits im Leben. Now, the thing about Gunkel is that he denied any useful arrangement of the Psalms because to him, they weren't arranged according to his forms that he identified. And for him, that means there's no intentional arrangement. And I feel like, well, maybe they're intentionally arranged. They just weren't looking for the forms that as he identified them. Not that they're not there. Maybe that just wasn't their intention. And then Mo Winkle would quote criticism. Let me just get, these are Herman Gunkel's forms. And then Mo Winkle would quote criticism. I'll skip that for now. It's in the dissertation. Then the third wave of Salter studies with Brevard Childs and his student, excuse me, Wilson. And what Childs did is he provided the scholarly discussion that focused on studying the Psalter as a whole in its final form in which it was handed down. He writes, quote, however one explains it, the final form of the Psalter is highly eschatological in nature. It looks toward the future and passionately yearns for its arrival. Wilson then came along and he provides a reading strategy where he shows the intentional editorial arrangement of the five books in the Psalms. After him, there were some literary report approaches that were born out of the third wave. And the first one was David Mitchell, and he wrote the eschatological program of the Psalms. And now what he does was really remarkable. He showed that it was prophetically messianic, but his schema, where he at the end of it almost seems like it would disqualify Jesus of Nazareth as that messianic person. Now, David Mitchell would later write another book called Messiah ben Joseph I think maybe to rehabilitate that a little bit. But even though he was identifying a prophetic program in the Psalms, I think his scheme didn't quite work with Jesus. At least that's how I read him. And then that brings me to Robert Cole. And Robert Cole, his dissertation was on book 3, where he showed the intentional juxtaposition. But the problem with Robert Cole was that he was reluctant to say that the superlative person in book 3 was not the blessed man of Psalm 1. Even though the lexical and some thematic links were there, he was reluctant to say that. So that's where I enter the conversation. My study aligns with Childs and Wilson that the Psalter should be studied holistically and viewed as intentionally arranged. It aligns with Mitchell that it is prophetically messianic. It aligns with Cole that there are thematic, syntactical, lexical, and other such links between several psalms and psalm groups. And it differs in that Psalms 1 and 2 are and the storyline elements are the prism by which the principle of juxtaposition is applied. That's where I come in. Now, again, the thesis, it's the abstract that was sent in the email, so you can read that. Just for the sake of time, I'll skip over it. But basically, there's 2 points here. The psalms are arranged, juxtaposed on purpose, intentionally, and the storyline elements are the guiding principle by which we're supposed to read one psalm to the next. So, the 2 necessary elements, storyline and juxtaposition. So I already showed this part. You have the cast of characters, you have the philosophy of the protagonist, the inciting moment, the conflict, and the resolution. Now, what happened here is, as I was starting to study this, I saw that in Psalm 2, there was something that looked like the inciting moment. Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords. There's Yahweh and the Messiah's cords from us. That's in Psalm 2. That's what the wicked want. They want to live independently of Yahweh and the Messiah. And in studying narrative criticism, there's always a resolution. And I wanted to know, is there a resolution in the book of Psalms? And what I see, if we go to Psalm 149, verses 5 through 9, you will see that there's actually a resolution. Notice what Psalm 149, verses 5 through 9 says, let the godly ones exult in glory. Let them sing for joy on their beds. Let the high praises of God be in their mouth. And notice this, and a two-edged sword in their hand to execute vengeance on the nations and punishment on the peoples, to bind their kings with chains and their nobles with fetters of iron, to execute on them the judgment written. So there's a resolution to the problem in Psalm 2 and to the promise of the wicked perishing in Psalm 1. And if there's a resolution at the end of the book of Psalms, then maybe this is the reading strategy the authors and editors intended for us to have. So that's what that really encouraged me to think that maybe we're on the right ground. Now, Psalms 1 and 2 is the introduction. They don't just give us the information, they modeled it for us. What I want you to do is notice on this slide here the lexical links that combine Psalm 1 and 2 together, showing that they're juxtaposed on purpose and that the thematic elements in one pick up in the next. And our job is to just trace the cast of characters and move that information on to the next Psalm 3, Psalm 4, Psalm 5. So in Psalm 1:1, you have Ashrei. In Psalm 2:12, it ends with Ashrei, the blessings of the man, and blessed are all those who take refuge in him. You have Yashav, the one in the seat, and then the blessed man doesn't do 3 things. He doesn't walk, stand, or sit with the wicked sinner scoffers, and that's in 1:1d. And then in 2:4, he who sits in the heavens. So all of these lexical links, I don't have time to go through all of them, but I can send this to you if you want it. But they're all here, and it shows you that Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 are juxtaposed on purpose. They model the strategy. Here are the characters, here are the lexical links, the thematic links that are juxtaposed, and that is the prism for reading the whole. So again, so our steps of analysis, we need to determine the cast of characters. You can do this in English, by the way. You don't need the Hebrew. And then we trace the plot movement based on the cast of characters and how they're juxtaposed. So here's some examples that I just wanted to show you that I have many of these in the dissertation, but here's examples. Here is Psalm 2 on the left and Psalm 3 on the right. And notice that this is Psalm 3 over here that I have in the Hebrew here. And then notice Psalm 2a against Yahweh, Al Yahweh, Psalm 2b and against his Messiah. The preposition al is used for the word translated against plus an object twice. The theme, the object of the wicked's hostility is Yahweh and the divine hero. And then in Psalm 3, you have alai and alai against me in Psalm 3:2 and Psalm 3:7. And it's against plus the object, and it occurs twice, like it occurs here. But the theme is the object of the wicked's hostility is the divine hero. So it demonstrates juxtaposition between Psalms 2 and 3. The juxtaposition continues. Not only that, but based on these links, the same characters are in view. In Psalm 2:7, Yahweh said to me, same syntax, you have amad plus preposition, al, plus the first person suffix me. And in Psalm 3:3, many are saying of my soul. And then you have the same syntax, amarim, plus the preposition lamed. Notice there's a lamed over here in this preposition, plus first person suffix e. The theme, affirmation, you are my son. The theme, denial, there is no salvation for him, that is the son, in God. In Psalm 2:6, Yahweh speaking about the divine hero, and I, ve'ani, will establish my king. In 3:6, the divine hero speaking about Yahweh, I lay down because Yahweh sustains me. What is the theme? Promise of establishing the divine hero as king. The theme, promise of kingship, divine hero can rest in spite of enemies. In Psalm 2:7, Yahweh says of the divine hero, you are my son. The theme with the second person pronoun atah. The theme, divine hero, is something to Yahweh, a son. In 3:4, the divine hero says of Yahweh, but you, O Yahweh, va'atah, O Yahweh, are a shield. Yahweh is something to the divine hero, a shield. So the what Psalms 1 and 2 did for us, give us the cast of characters, the inciting moment, the plot movement, the philosophy of the protagonist to establish the king, and then the principle of juxtaposition, they're juxtaposed on purpose. What that gives us continues from Psalm 2 to Psalm 3. And this is identifying the divine hero. But we can also identify the wicked. And notice that here, the wicked take a stand, Yatsav. The wicked take their stand against Yahweh and the divine hero in Psalm 2:2. And in Psalm 3:2, the semantic link, kum, many are rising up against the divine hero. So the take a stand and then the word for stand. It's a different lexical item or lexeme, but it's still the syntactic or semantically, they're part of the same, a similar semantic domain. The wicked are warned to serve God with fear. And then later in 3:7, the divine hero is not afraid of his enemies, which would be the wicked. In Psalm 2:9, the divine hero is going to break and shatter the nations. In Psalm 3:8, again, semantic linkages here from 3:8. They strike and shatter, and they're synonymous lexemes. Who strikes in Psalm 2:9? The divine hero. Who strikes in Psalm 3:8? Yahweh. Who is struck in Psalm 2:9? The wicked. Who is struck in Psalm 3:8? The wicked. So we can identify the wicked based on these links as well. So we're able to trace the cast of characters based on juxtaposition from one psalm to the other. These links identify them. Now, those are just two examples. There's many in the dissertation that I found between Psalms 1 all the way through Psalm 8 that really demonstrate you can identify the cast of characters from one psalm to the next. And I think that's how the New Testament authors were reading it. Now, this is what I end up finding. This is a summary of everything that I found. And what I found is that Psalms 1 and 2 are set up by the narrator. He gives us the cast of characters, Yahweh and the divine hero, the antagonist, the wicked and the emergent singular enemy, the foils, the righteous who switch sides and experience blessing, the inciting moment, the hostility, the wicked's hostility towards Yahweh and the divine hero, the philosophy of the protagonist to establish the divine hero on Mount Zion in a worldwide Malkut, and the enduring conflict, death for the wicked and blessing for the righteous who pledge fealty to Yahweh. Now, in Psalm 3, we get the first conflict based on the introduction of Psalms 1 and 2. And this is what I call zoomed out conflict. There's a multiplication of enemies. The divine hero cries out to Yahweh, and Yahweh answers him from his holy mountain. Now, that's interesting because in Psalm 2, he says, I will establish my king on Mount Zion, but it's always translated as a past tense because we assume David is the one being established in Psalm 2. Rather, this is prophetic looking forward. It should be translated as a prophetic future. I will establish my king on Mount Zion, because when we get to Psalm 3, he's crying out and Yahweh answers him from the holy mountain. He's not established on the mountain yet. So that's still future. So when we read it holistically from one psalm to the next, our interpretations actually will need to be adjusted. Um, in Psalm 3, Yahweh protects him, thus he can sleep and wake up despite the proliferation of his enemies. He's promised a future destruction of the wicked, and then there's a reaffirmation that the wicked can repent by pleading fealty to Yahweh and experience blessing. That's how Psalm 3 ends. It's a zoomed out conflict. And that leads to the second conflict, which is close up in Psalm 4. And we know it's close up because the divine hero confronts the wicked in Psalm 4. They are further identified as his countrymen. We see that they're in Israel, that they know the Torah, and that they're longing for grain and new wine, and that they're more concerned with that than with fealty to Yahweh. They're admonished to not sin and offer sacrifices of righteousness, but they feign fealty to Yahweh and are shown to be more interested in, again, grain and new wine, materialism and false security. But there's no violence that takes place in Psalm 4. The divine hero lies down for bed and Yahweh keeps him safe. And that leads to Psalms 5 through 8, which are a night monologue, four speeches or prayers that the divine hero utters, culminating in Psalm 8, an explosion of praise to Yahweh's name for his treatment of the divine hero, for his protection of him. And this is the narrative peak of a well-known inclusio that goes all the way to Psalm 14. And what we have here again are the night monologues, Psalm 5 through 8. The first speech or prayer, Psalm 5, imprecatory prayer against the wicked for feigned fealty. That's where he says that their throats are an open grave, that they only speak falsehood, and he's referring to the words, in context are the words that they spoke in Psalm 4. The second speech is Psalm 6, and he cries out for help while in agony, the weight of chastening according to 2 Samuel. He quotes 2 Samuel 7:14b in Psalm 6, and the conflict that he's enduring with the wicked takes its toll on him. And then in the third speech prayer is in Psalm 7, and he reaffirms that Yahweh will judge the wicked to condemnation and the divine hero to vindication. And then there's the emergence of a singular wicked enemy, and that enemy will perish. Now, what's interesting is that in Psalm 5, there is a third masculine singular description of a man of bloodshed. And then in Psalm 7, there's a third masculine singular verb about one who tears like a lion. And the nearest antecedent is the person in Psalm 5, showing that they're juxtaposed and that the story is continuing, that there's plot movement. Now, the last phrase in Psalm 7, the divine hero promises to sing praise to Yahweh's name. And Psalm 8 is an inclusio that begins with praise to Yahweh's name and ends with praise to Yahweh's name, demonstrating that Psalm 8 is the song that the divine hero promised to praise Yahweh's name, that he promised he would sing at the end of Psalm 7. So that's what I yielded in my study. And that leads me to my last point here is new vistas for further study. And again, I couldn't cover the entirety of the book of Psalms. It would be too much work, but I think I've given enough of a reading strategy that we can move forward. So anyone who's younger than me and has the bandwidth to do it should, if you're in school at Schaefer or at another seminary and you want to do doctoral studies or a master's thesis, you should try to take this method and apply it to more Psalms, Psalms 9 through 14 and beyond. Or you can look at the Dead Sea Scroll, 11 QPSA. It has an interesting arrangement, and I studied it in a preliminary sense, and they seem to be following the method that I'm doing. I just couldn't go further because my page count it would have taken too long. So that's a study someone can take on. Or investigate more corroborating evidence in the New Testament. I touch on the New Testament use of the Psalms in my dissertation, and I show that this method seems to be the reading strategy they're using, how they just simply take for granted passages are about the Messiah. And I think by taking the storyline elements and the principle of juxtaposition, tracing the cast of characters, that's how they're doing it. So someone can maybe do that. And in conclusion, I give in preliminary remarks the genesis of the present study, introduction of the present study, where this dissertation enters the scholarly conversation, the thesis and the steps of analysis, my findings, at least some of them, and new vistas for further study. And so now I want to conclude. Years ago, Joseph Brenham published an article, a very short article called Psalms 1 through 8, Some Hidden Harmonies. And he says this: I wish to suggest that a consecutive reading of the Hebrew Psalter leads to the conclusion that one of the principles governing the compilation of this collection was that of juxtaposing psalms in such a way that various key words and expressions in one pick up and develop a theme already enunciated in another. If this hypothesis has any merit, it not only provides an inner coherence for an otherwise apparently unorganized collection, but it also casts some light on the history of exegesis by giving us some idea of the way in which the Psalms may have been understood by those who compiled and handed them down to us. Now, this is great, but this isn't the whole story. The principle of juxtaposition is not enough. That's why he entitled this Some Hidden Harmonies. When we add to that the cast of characters, the inciting moment, and plot movement from psalm to psalm, then I submit to you that the harmonies are no longer hidden. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. That was really good.
Thank you.
All right, we'll open the floor for questions, comments, and discussion. Um, I've got a question
Sure.
regarding the authorship and compiling of the Psalms.
Mhm.
You had mentioned earlier that you're not taking the superscriptions as original, and I looked into that. I came across two volumes on East Syriac psalm headings.
Mhm.
Because there are only two volumes on East Syriac psalm headings, which is about one or two volumes too many.
Yeah.
uh, but I was flipping through that, and to my surprise, the Peshitta takes the opinion that several of the psalms were written in the context of the Maccabean period, which I
Yeah.
thought was interesting. I'd always assumed that anyone holding to that late of an authorship or compiling of the psalms is going to come from a more liberal bent, but that's a more classic bent that I don't think has been influenced by the modern. It does raise questions, though. So, when are you saying that the psalm was compiled, and if possible, by whom? It sounds like you're having some Davidic writings that are being compiled later. It seems that some of the writings or some of the psalms are intertextual to the Second Samuel. Um, so, are you seeing David, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, writing psalms that he did not understand at the time, would later be used and pulled together with other inspired writings to show through juxtaposition a messianic timeline? Is that kind of what you're seeing with the chronicling of the psalms?
Yeah, so I see David as very, very involved in the for sure in book one of the Psalms,
Okay.
especially the ones that have his heading. So I see him no undoubtedly as one of the main authors of several of the Psalms. And there's a in column 27 of PS 11Q PSA, there's a prose insert that gives this. It's column 27 that gives all of the songs that David wrote. Now, some have interpreted that as the Messianic David. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are definitely dealing with a pre-Septuagint, or at least around the time of the Septuagint era, copy of the Psalms. I deal with that. So the book of Psalms, I don't think is written as late as the Maccabean period. I think it was written earlier than that. I think David had a huge hand in it. Probably the best dissertation on that. Now he does argue for Davidic that the superscriptions and all of the titles are authentic. It's a guy by the name of Skinner, and I think he did it at Andrews College dissertation. I cite him in mine, but he gives some really compelling evidence for an earlier date, and I kind of follow along that line. I think what David did is he gave the process by which Psalms 1 and 2. I attribute Psalms 1 and 2 to Davidic authorship. I think David knew he was writing messianically, prophetically. I don't think he was unaware, and I think he gave us the pattern, and it models it for If there's later editors, I don't have a problem with that. But I think they were following. They had a framework in mind as it whether it grew by accretion or however we want to say it, that it whatever was handed down to us, the way it was finally arranged and edited, they had a pattern in mind for how it was supposed to look. I think Psalm 149, with the resolution to the problem raised in Psalm 2, argues strongly for that. I don't think that we can, I think the days of interpreting each psalm individually are over. We can't do that anymore. The links that connect them together and bind them together are so overwhelming. I just think we were blinded from seeing it that way for a long time. But no,
I
I think it
agree.
was written early. Parts of it, yeah.
We,
Yeah.
we harp so much on reading the Bible contextually. Why aren't we reading the Psalms contextually?
Yes. Yeah.
So when you say
Prophetically,
an earlier date, are you saying like Persian era or Babylonian or what are we looking at there?
I would definitely argue for uh, during David's lifetime.
Oh, wow.
So
For the
I would argue.
compilation of it?
No, 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 no. Just
Uh,
for large chunks of it. Yeah. In terms of its completion, it would have to be before the Septuagint because the Septuagint clearly had a copy of the MS 150. Also, I don't have the quotes in front of me. They're in my dissertation, but of evidence that they were written before the Septuagint was that task was undertaken. So, sometime from David's life to that point is where I think the entirety was composed. Also, there's a lot of evidence in the Dead Sea Scrolls that whoever the Dead Sea community, the Qumran community were, that they had knowledge of the Masoretic 150. There's a gematria value to the Psalm Scroll 11Q PSA that is divisible by the number 150. So they're doing something with it. So that's where I would be.
That's always a frustrating thing
Yeah.
when serving in Russian language context,
Yeah.
because Russian language Bibles will follow the Septuagint
Yeah.
ordering of the Psalms, and you always got to figure out, okay, which whenever there's a multilingual thing happening, you got to figure out which Psalm are we talking about here, due to all
And
that mess. So,
in the Septuagint, I think Psalm 51, in the Masoretic text, I think it says when David entered Bathsheba, it's a sexual kind of thing, the sin of Bathsheba. And the Septuagint, I think it says when David went to Beersheba. So it's like, well, that's a different take, right? So, um, so anyway, I thought that was neat. My
I'd like to
man,
offer a question.
Dan
Dr. Dan.
Stitch.
I could wait if
No, please do. Whoever wants to
okay.
go. Yeah.
Eduardo, it's wonderful, wonderful study you've done here. It's really, I think, providing a lot of insight. Like the connections between the Psalms.
Yeah.
Wanted to go back to comments you made about David Mitchell's work.
Hmm.
Would you, I'm looking for like a macro structure to pull the Psalms together. So it looks like you have a micro structure,
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
Yes.
Uh, David Mitchell seems to offer an eschatological macro structure. Would you dismiss that
No.
from Mitchell's work? Okay.
No, no, not at all. I like Mitchell's work. I mean, he had some really profound stuff of how the nations come together and at the end of a wonderful. The problem was that his scheme, the way he published it, unfortunately, you can't have Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah in that scheme because he
Hmm.
has the Messiah establishing the kingdom first and then dying. I don't know how you make Jesus work that way.
Yeah.
That was my criticism of him.
Yeah.
It's in my reading of him. So no, I think his macro structure, I think he was on something great. Even my Dr. Fater, Dr. Dunham, in the notes when I wrote on Mitchell's part, when I got that back from him, he was like, "This is really good." It is. I like Mitchell. It's just that I think he disqualifies Jesus of
Yeah.
Nazareth as a potential for that Messiah. I
So
don't think he that.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So based on your study, Mitchell posits groups of psalms that match to an eschatological phase. Would you
You know,
expect? Would you
he didn't even do
expect
that.
the? Beg your pardon?
He didn't even do that. What he did is he went outside the Psalms and concentrated on three passages in the Old Testament: Zechariah 9 through 14, Joel 2 through 3, and I forget the third one because I'm just going off the top of my head. But he doesn't even do that. He didn't spend a lot of time in the Psalms. He spent a lot of time in those passages and then showed how there's some affinity with some of the statements in the Psalms. So,
Right.
but I can't criticize him for that because I did the same thing. I could only cover 7 Psalms.
That's
So,
right.
you
That's
know,
right.
so it's,
No,
but
that's right. I think he was just suggesting,
yeah.
but what I'm wondering, based on your study, then, uh, those seams that he
Mhm.
has between those groups of psalms, would you expect the juxtapositioning of the psalms to kind of reset on
Mhm.
each of those seams?
Yes. I think the seams of the 5 books in the Psalms are
Hmm.
solid. Those aren't going anywhere. Those are fixed and they're on purpose. I
Yeah,
think it would shift the schema that Mitchell came up with, but it wouldn't eradicate it.
I see.
I
Okay,
just need
that's
some young
that's a
bloods
good
to come up.
distinction. Yeah.
Yeah, I need some young bloods to come up and take over, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
That's all.
Continue. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I appreciate your insight.
I
Appreciate
appreciate
your
you,
work.
Dr. Thank you, Dr. Den. I appreciate you, my man.
Yeah. Hmm.
Eduardo, first I want to thank you. Excellent paper,
Thank
and
you.
I have to say that I've come to many of the same conclusions. You've gone way farther in developing this than I've done in my reading of the Psalms. But I think you're absolutely right, and
Thank you.
I like the the connecting of Psalms 1 and 2 as the introduction. I think that's really key to the entire book of Psalms. I do have a couple of questions though. When we think about the canonical interpretation of Psalms and understanding the book of Psalms the way it was arranged, that arrangement, as you've said, came at some time in the development of the entire canon of the Tanakh. And that arrangement was made by some individuals, maybe some in Hezekiah's time, maybe some in later times. Do you see the arrangement as an inspired arrangement, or alternately, simply the wise view of people who are much closer to the Psalms than we are today? In other words, how much authority do we put in the arrangement?
Okay, that's a really good question. It was one that was asked at my defense.
Okay, all right.
And so the best that I can do with that is um, uh, in line with Selhammer and Brevard Childs. We
Mhm.
need to study it in the fashion that it was handed down to us,
Yeah.
and I'm comfortable with that. I had to deal with a liberal scholar who said that based on that concept of it growing over time, that the individual psalm was the only thing that could be considered canonical at any time. And the criticism of that would be, well, what about the entire canon? Right? The entire canon grew over time through progressive revelation, and it was handed down. There is some wisdom in how the ancients handed it down, and we can do it chronologically. It works. We can do it messianically, the way I think the Old Testament Hebrew Bible arranges it more with a messianic intention. We can do it that way, and it still works. But the point of it would be there's still a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so I'm comfortable with saying, I'm going to hang out with Brevard Childs here and say I'm going to take how it was handed down to us, and that's the way we need to study it, the same way we do the Torah, the way it was handed down. So the compositional framework. So I don't know if that's sufficient, but that's right now without what I'm comfortable saying.
Okay, I think that's fair, and I think that is a potential weakness,
Yeah.
but it's the best we can deal with. I think that would be my conclusion too, and so I appreciate that. Um, One other potential weakness in your presentation is when you were establishing similarities, especially lexical similarities between Psalm 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and so on through 8. Uh, Many of the terms that you used were very, very common
Mhm.
biblical words. And some of those could simply be due to coincidence rather than intentional repetition of terms. I think some of the words you looked at, I think are more legitimate than others, but some of those were just very common words you'd find anyway by coincidence.
Yeah. So my response to that also was raised in my defense.
Okay.
I appreciate you very much.
I wasn't there.
But it is true. I think it was what's her name? I have her book here in my office. She wrote the biblical poetry books, very well known. I can't think of her name right now. Adele Berlin. And she said that we have to be careful because sometimes there's just a limited number of phonological or morphological uses of or words, right? But what I tried to do was, and I did get dinged on Amar, right? Ahmad, very common word, very common.
Yeah.
But the syntax, it wasn't just the lexical, it was the syntax. You have the same syntax, similar lexemes, pronominal suffixes, the prepositional phrases that were introduced in the exact same way. For example, at the end of Psalm 5, or the beginning of Psalm 5, there are 4 requests made by the divine hero. And at the end of Psalm 6, there are 4 affirmations that those requests have been met. You see what I mean? So it's like,
yeah, right.
So it's not just the words, it's the words but yes, the criticism is there, and I understand it. But if the juxtaposition and the cast of characters can be traced, then I think that's warrants at least the fresh look of it.
Yeah. Good. I got one more question for you. You obviously had to do a lot of work on Psalms 1 and 2 in preparation for this. Just something I've observed in Psalm 2, and I wondered about. I haven't seen others really comment on this. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to find out if you did anything on that. In Psalm 2:6, where it talks about Yahweh installing his king on Mount Zion. Mm-hmm. That particular word for install is an unusual one. It's the Hebrew is nasak, which usually means to pour out, like in pouring out a libation or pouring out some liquid or something like that. And it seems to me that this is very, very picturesque of what God is going to do when the Messiah comes. He can pour it out literally from heaven to earth. Mm-hmm. It's a downward movement from heaven to earth. And other kings were not installed on Mount Zion. They were installed maybe down by the Gihon Spring or somewhere else. But installing someone on Mount Zion is very unique. And this seems to me to be a picture not of, well, certainly David was not anointed on Mount Zion. And so this seems to be like a very, very clear Messianic reference. But that picture of being poured out onto Mount Zion seems really interesting to me. I wonder if you've thought about that or interacted with that.
I didn't, unfortunately, on that point, but I did show how it should be translated as a future tense. A prophetic future. So I did do that, but also I didn't catch it there, but I did catch it in Psalm 6. And in Psalm 6, he says, and if it's the divine hero in Psalm 6, he says, let me not be chastised, or do not chastise me in your anger. And you're like, if he's the messianic person, why would he get chastised? Yeah. He's quoting 2 Samuel 7:14b. In Psalm 2, he quotes 2 Samuel 7:14a. And in Psalm 6, he quotes part B of that same verse. And it's a hifil. So he's like, do not cause me to be chastised, or when he is made to be sin. And then Isaiah picks up both references from 2 Samuel and from Psalm 6 and binds them together about in Isaiah 53:5 about the Messiah being chastised for our iniquity. Marvelous. I have a chart and an image, a figure on that I put in. It's in the dissertation where I demonstrate that he's not David with sin. This is the divine hero anticipating his suffering because he's quoting the 2 Samuel, the Davidic covenant. So, yeah, I didn't catch what you were saying, but I did catch something like that later. Yeah,
sure. Wonderful. Thank you. I need to get a copy of your dissertation.
I'll send it to you. Just you can't grade it, okay?
All right.
The diploma is already on the wall, so it's.
Thank you, Eduardo.
I'd love to send it to you. Thank you. I'll send it to you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
A little bit with me? Not right quite yet. have a couple things I need to do real quickly.
Okay.
I can put up stuff in the free.
We had a hot mic there for a second.
No worries. No worries. Thank you.
All right. Well, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Dr. Perez. This was excellent work. I look forward to seeing what comes from further study on this topic. I appreciate the advice for moving forward as well. So.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for giving me your rapt attention. And it's been my pleasure to, just share something from the Psalms that I think would help the church. So.
This has been Ed Perez talking about Messiah in the Psalms with the International Society for Biblical Hermeneutics. Thanks for tuning in.